Hey everybody, it is Pastor Megan and I am at Grace Lutheran tonight, and this is a collage of Jesus made from magazines and from cardboard, and I kind of like that it looks like Jesus is hugging me right now. Hey everybody. Oh. So you made it. You made it to tonight's class, which is on queer saints. I'm super excited to share some of these saints with you, especially as we get closer to All Saints Sunday. But first, a few logistics. There are children painting pumpkins next to me. Hopefully they'll be as quiet as possible. If you are watching on the Zoom webinar, we are in webinar format, which means that you can chat in the chat box if you want to talk to other people who are on the webinar, or you can lift up questions in the Q&A section. It's super helpful if you use the Q&A box for the questions, so it's easier for me to find them. If you are watching on Facebook Live, you can just type any comments right into the chat box that goes along with the live video, and I'll be checking out both. There's a slight delay on the Facebook Live, so I'll see your questions, but it might just take a second to see your questions. The other thing that you should know is if you are someone who likes to take notes, you will have access to the full PowerPoint of this class. It's already in the Google Drive on the event page. It's pinned right to the top where you can find the PDF of the PowerPoint. You'll also get a copy of the recorded class there, both in video and audio version. And if you would like to share the class with other people, you are welcome to do so. I'm just so grateful that you are helping out and that the proceeds of this class will help our congregation offset some of the rentals that are lost during the coronavirus. So it's really lovely to see you. All right. We're going to talk queer saints tonight. Know that most of the queer saints that I'm going to share with you are early Christian saints. And I do this on purpose because there are so many people who say, well, around the time of Jesus, there weren't LGBTQ people. When in fact, there were tons of LGBTQ people. The Roman Empire probably had more LGBTQ people than we have now. And many of these saints that are in the traditional saints calendars became saints because people thought they were LGBTQ. So I might use the term queer tonight. That's referring to a type of academic thought. And when we're talking about history, it's really important because I don't personally know how any of these folk identify. So there'll be a number of saints who were born and classified as female at birth. Then they lived lives in monasteries in men's clothing. It's hard for us to know from our vantage point in the future if they were wearing men's clothing because that was the only way you got to wear pants, and people wear pants now, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're male. For some of them, they really did identify as male. Others, we just don't really know. There were a lot of different dynamics of the cultures, and instead of trying to figure out what people believed and how they self-identified, particularly because the only stories that we probably have about many of these people is written by other autobiography writers. So it would be the equivalent of if my cousin wrote a story about me after I died, and they might or might not get it right, how I want to be pronounced. A few of the saints, I want to give you a warning right now, a few of the saints that maybe were identified one way at their birth and lived another way in their life, I have put both of their names, not because I think dead naming or the naming of what someone's former name was is important, but because so many of their names, like when you go into a monastery, you take a new name like Mary or James or Peter. And so if you want to learn more about these saints, it would be really hard to do it with just one of those names. I'm going to do my best to use gender neutral pronouns, but most of the saint descriptions that I'm going to present to you tonight are from my book, Queerly Lutheran. It has a saints calendar in the back. And back in 2009, when that book was published, they and them wasn't something that was common yet. In fact, in 2009, we used a pronoun called sie and zer. Somebody use Z and Zer tonight. Some people like using Z and Zer even now. But if you want to replace it with they and them, that's completely fine. The idea was to find a pronoun that would fit for folk whom we don't know how they necessarily identified. There's also going to be a number of saints in this collection who are queer because of their theology, right? A lot of people who are commonplace saints might not be, well, we don't know what their own sexual preferences are because a lot of them were celibate and living monastic life, but they might have thought of Jesus as the person they were married to. And if they were male and thought of Jesus as someone they were married to, that's kind of our best guess at them being queer identified. They might have also had a theology that thought of like Jesus as a mother or Jesus as female. And so the way that they were a saint was queer, even if we don't know how they identified particularly. And then there's another group of saints, which is just that queer people loved them, right? That they gained popularity because they inspired folk, maybe because they had beautiful bodies that looked cool in art, and maybe because we don't even know why. Some of the histories were that queer people attached themselves to some of the saints. There's a long collection. I'm gonna try to make it through about 58 tonight, and so some of them I'll just kind of briefly stop on, and some of them you'll notice delight me a lot, and so I might say a bit more about them. I've done my best to connect some of the ancient icons and paintings about saints. Yeah, one thing that you might want to know about saints, if you don't know about icons, is that, see Jesus here has a round halo. A round halo means that someone painted the artwork after the person died. And so people are just giving it their best guess what that person looked like. But it's not painted at the time of their life and looks a lot like them. A square halo is what is used in iconography for someone who is painted during their lifetime. So a number of these icons will be imperfect. They might have whiter skin tone than the individuals actually had. But you'll be able to tell if they were actual likenesses or just imagined likenesses by the shape of their halo. All right, let's start talking saints. Are you ready? I'm excited. Here we go. So first before I get too far, so Queerly Lutheran is the book that I'm taking a lot of these saints stories from, but I have a couple of other books you might be interested in. Letters from My Brothers and Manifest are two books of trans essays. Transgender Children of God, It's a Boy, Girl, or Both are kids' books, and Vanguard Revisited is poetry from LGBTQ homeless youth, both in the 1960s and in 2011. All right, saints. Let's begin with one of those folk that I talked to you about earlier, the folk who were born and assigned female at birth and then lived a monastic life as male. Often the story that is commonly used for these is that the person either is hiding, trying to escape marriage, because I guess getting married was really gross back then, or that the person has lived monastic life long enough that they like lived a rugged life in a terrible cell and they get disfigured, so disfigured that they don't seem like they're females anymore, and they go and live as in male monasteries. One of the reasons that this is possible is because in the Gospel of Thomas, there is an argument saying, why is Mary Magdalene so smart? She can't possibly be so smart. Only boys are smart. And the answer that they came up with was that when you were baptized, you got the Greek word for spirit and the Greek word for water. When you put the two words together, you got the Greek word for sperm. They literally believed that when you were born again into a holy life, everyone was male. And that's why people were saved. It's a terrible feminist idea, but it led to lots of trans umbrella saints. So Apollinaria, I'm going to do my best to pronounce them the best I can. Apollinaria or Dorotheos is one of the first. I'm doing these in calendar order of when they are on the saints calendar. So we're starting with January 5th. Dorotheos was a female-born ascetic who wore male monastic habits. Another common part of these stories is fleeing wealthy families. So fleeing a wealthy life in Rome. And Dorotheos was someone who was in monastic life long enough that they became disfigured and then started living as a man. And then what's interesting to notice is that they refused to identify as female even when they were condemned falsely of rape of another person. So a number of these saints, part of the reason that they're saints is because when people accused them of fathering children, instead of saying, I can't father children, I'm not fertile in that way, they often raised the children for the rest of their lives and oftentimes were kicked out of the monastic community. And then upon their death, it was discovered what their anatomy looked like. And so then people were like, wow, that person was a saint. They raised this child anyway. And so that's a part of this first narrative. Polyeuctus and Nearchus are two saints who were paired together by Christians as a same-sex couple and evoked in Adelphi ceremonies. And in this idea of like brotherly love ceremonies. John Boswell, who wrote some revolutionary stuff about same-sex marriages in early Christianity, writes about them as historical proof of Christian monogamous same-sex relationships in the early church. And there is a huge church still built for Polyeuctus around Constantinople. And I love that their final words together are often cited. Remember our secret vow. Aelred of Rivalich, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. I don't think that's how it's pronounced, is in the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. And in 1135, at the age of 26, entered an abbey and then became an abbot and remained there until their time of death. And part of the cool thing that this saint did is imagined a transgender Jesus, imagining in his spiritual life that a naked breast will feed you that comes from Jesus. And this is really common. It's talked about in a lot of biblical scriptures that the males who are faithful in biblical scripture literally breastfeed people with the wisdom of their spirit. And if you don't believe me, think of the song, Rock My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham, Rock My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham. And so Aelred believed that Jesus breastfed folk. If you think it's queer, then I'm living up to it, queer saints. There is also a lot of queerness that is made of how people kiss during the passing of the peace and how soothing it's found. So Aelred imagines spiritual kisses as a salve, and that the spirit flows between you where you join yourself and cleave to him, that the soul mingles with the soul and the two become one. So this is kind of erotic imaginings of being in relationship with Christ. So in the same way that some nuns saw themselves as the brides of Christ, some monastics saw themselves as the brides of Christ. Saint Sebastian is in the pile of queer saints because of the following he had. Saint Sebastian is easily found in paintings because of all of the arrows that were the cause of Saint Sebastian being a martyr, but because Saint Sebastian was always painted in a hunky way, Saint Sebastian got a queer following and was remembered kind of because of that. And so hunky saints make the list because of people who really appreciated those saints. Agnes of Manseda is one of those female monastics who were labeled as female at birth, who lived as male. Her story is that she was trying to avoid marriage or to remain celibate. This book that is up on the screen, Clothes Makes the Man, and I'll send you a book list at the end of this as well, so that if you want to check out any of these books, you can read more about people. Clothes Make the Man is a look at many of these kind of cross-dressing, maybe trans folk that were kind of well-known and liked by people kind of in this early Christian period through medieval times. Strangely, when there was a big plague is when people got really scared of their bodies because they didn't know how they would get sick. And so in times of pandemic, people get scared and try to limit the ways that people can be free in their expressions. Just something to watch out for. Euphosine and Smaragdus is another one of those folk who was assigned female at birth and lives as a male monastic. Again, but this one's interesting because they were born through like a prayer. Their parents were very old and they were born, and then there was an arranged marriage with a wealthy young noble. And while her dad was gone, or their dad was gone, they gave away all their things and first became a monk and then started wearing men's clothes. This is another part of the theme, is that sometimes people had to hide from people who were out to get them. And then they would wear men's clothes in order to hide from people who were out to get them. So Smaragdus wears men's clothes to hide from the family in order to avoid this marriage, and then is so pretty that it's a distraction to the other male monks. Right? Maybe those other male monks should be on my list too. But then becomes kind of known for their holiness and their wisdom, and even ends up teaching their father, but their father doesn't recognize them later. And on their deathbed is when they revealed themselves to their father, who by that time had become a monk. Mary or Marinos of Alexandria is another monastic who was identified as female at birth and had a period of living in a monastery. But this time it's at the request of their father. And that's because they believed the whole world was sinful and bad things would happen to a girl. So you better pretend to be a boy so nothing bad happens to you, is the way this story is written. The dangers of domestic violence, the dangers of what happens to women in brutal ways when they are over-sexualized is a theme in some of these tales. This also is another saint who is accused of fathering a child. And here they raise the child, leave the monastery, and 5 years later, they're allowed to come back to the monastery with the child. And I think that's pretty cool that people adopted, they got to present to the outside world as a different sex than they had been diagnosed as a child, and they got to raise kids. Perpetua and Felicity are some of the most famous of queer saints, and While we don't know what was really up with them, they were both a part of 5 Christians who were condemned to death because of their faith and were going to be killed by wild animals and swords. And during the time they were in prison, they consoled each other and comforted each other. And in their final moments, gave each other a kiss of peace. Were they? Weren't they? We don't really know. But the reason that they became saints, the reason that people remembered them, the reason that their stories are carried forward to this day is because Christians in that time period liked that story, that they were together, that they loved each other. And so it can be again, yes? Anastasia and Anastasios, the patrician or of Constantinople, was another person who was diagnosed as female at birth and wore male monastic habits. Anastasia, this is one where the ruler or the Emperor Justinian really, really, really wanted to do sexual things to them. And they really, 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 really wanted to hide from them and not have sexual things done to them. And so they joined the monastery and hid. And as often is the case, they were discovered as being someone who was diagnosed as female at birth because they had pierced ears. Dun, dun, dun. Oh, okay. I just need you to look for a second at Longinus here. Longinus has a great pompadour in this icon. Longinus is the name folk have for the centurion who was around at the time of Jesus's death, the one who says, "Surely this is the Son of God," when Jesus dies. And it's also conflated with, there is a centurion who comes to Jesus, and it's in Luke chapter 7, and says, "Will you heal my," and the Greek word is pais, which is often translated slave or servant, which is a different Greek word. The word pais usually is the term for the passive partner in a same-sex male relationship. And so this is Jesus, and Jesus heals him. Longinus has a faith that says, you don't have to come to my house, but you could heal my partner if you wanted to. And Jesus is like, all right. And so this is one of the stories that folk lift up. It's so, whatever centurion you would like it to be. They also say that Longinus is the dude who poked Jesus in the side with the spear. That's a lot of stories to put all together, but that's one of my favorite icons with the whooped hair. Oh, this is a good one. You should read this book if you want to read a book about a queer saint. So Catalina de Erasio, who becomes known as Francesco Loyola, is known as Lieutenant Nun, and originally is in a nunnery, but escapes, like doesn't want to be there, leaves, and runs away to Latin America at age 15 to become a soldier, takes the name Francisco Loyola, and even the autobiographies use the pronoun he, that he is the pronoun that they self-identified with. It's a little later than early Christianity, but it's an awesome story, so you ought to know about it. Francesco gets engaged to at least 2 ladies, flees before the marriage goes through, is condemned to death several times because there was a lot of fighting going on at the time, and has to beg for the church's pardon. And so the begging of the church pardon is for it being wrong, I guess, for people assigned female at birth to wear men's clothing. That's not how I read things, but Francesco asks for the Pope's pardon and gets it. So Pope Urban VIII issues papal license for Francesco to keep wearing male clothes. Good job. There might be some popes in here that you like. It's going to be okay. King James. This one's a very important one. King James I, who's got I think he's also King James VI, if you talk about the King of Scotland part, has a very profound effect on the church, because if you've ever heard of the King James Bible is named after King James. King James was kind of known to have been bisexual or thought to be bisexual, or they made fun of him. So they couldn't make fun of King James out loud because they would be beheaded. So they put those ways to make fun of King James in the Bible. So the very first kind of English translations that have words that are unkind to gay people are in the King James Bible as a way to make fun of King James, not because they are true to the translation. So we lift up King James as one of the first queer folk who has ever had a Bible used as a weapon against him. Okay. This story is ridiculous, but it's super fun. So put on your seatbelt. There's no feast date, just that it happens on Easter, right? So this is the Abbot of Drimnach. It's hard to pronounce because it's Gaelic, I believe. So he has a miraculous sex change twice. So the abbot on Easter falls asleep on a rock, a special rock, wakes up, and their sword turned into a sewing kit. I know, not all the details are the best, but it's still a great story. So the sword turns into a sewing kit, their men's clothes were turned into a women's dress, and their beard was gone. Then they're like, I'm a girl now. So what do? They were married previously to a woman when they were male. They wake up in the dress with the sewing kit. So they go marry a hunky guy. So they marry a handsome young man who works in Crumlin Church. They instantly fall in love and get married. But the abbot of Drimnach, not the smartest. Guess where he falls asleep another Easter? On the same rock. Guess what happens? Turns back into a male. Guess who he runs into? His wife from before. So he goes and has a little chat with this handsome guy that he married, and the courts decide that he can have the 4 kids he gave birth to physically with the hunky guy and go be with his wife, and the hunky guy's his friend now. The abbot of Drimnach. Why don't you know these stories? These are awesome stories. Like, he was an abbot. That's like a thing that happened to a priest. And this is the actual kind of scroll where the story was written down. Hildegonde of Nice was a nun who lived under the name Brother Joseph in the Cistern monastery of Chenau. I don't know much about them. I don't speak French. But if you do, there's a book you can read about them. Anselms. A lot of people know Saint Anselm. Anselm is kind of known as having been the Bishop of Canterbury back in the 1100s. And what's neat about them is that they probably were celibate. because they were living a monastic life. But he had strong emotional relationships with a guy named Lanfranc, and then a succession of his students. And he would address them in letters with the words, "Beloved lover." And here's an example. "Wherever you go, my love follows you, and wherever I remain, my desire embraces you. How then could I forget you? He who is imprisoned on my heart like a seal on wax, how could he be removed from my memory? Without saying a word, I know that you love me. And without my saying a word, you know that I love you." Anselm was one of the first of the saints who referred to Jesus as mother as well. George, St. George, pictured here with what he is most famous for, killing a dragon. That's probably why there aren't dragons around anymore. George killed them. So at one point, George was going to get married, but is prevented by Jesus. And here's how they wrote about it. George did not know that Christ was keeping him as a pure vaginal bridegroom for himself. Later on, after mind-boggling escapades, George is killed and resurrected a number of times. And Christ welcomes George into heaven with bridal imagery. In these texts, George is presented as the bridegroom of Christ. Bridal imagery is really common, but usually male saints are made into brides of Christ. But George is one of very few saints where they are called the bridegroom of Christ. So two men in this relationship. Ironically, St. George is the patron saint of scouting. Catherine of Siena was an Italian nun who started having visions at age 6. And in these visions, one of the mentors of Catherine had a vision that Catherine's face transformed into a bearded man, symbolizing her mystical union with Christ by becoming spiritually transgender. I don't know what that means entirely, but that's how they talked about it in the 1300s. The feast of Julian of Norwich. Julian is another one of those saints who is very well known and very well celebrated. I love the way she's petting the cat. It makes me happy. Julian talked about God or goddess as our mother and experienced God as pure love. She saw Jesus as a loving mother, full of warmth and care for her children, and emphasized immensely attractive spirituality, emphasizing God's love for human beings, and that in the end, all will be well, and all shall be well, and all will be well. And so, if you're keeping score, Julian of Norwich was a bride of Christ, but Christ was female in their marriage. Pope John VII. So what you need to know is in ye olde times, and you know, the Reformation happens in about the 1500s. So the Catholic Church would do things for money prior to this time that made people uncomfortable. And the way that you became Pope is not the same as the process now where they go and vote on things. The way that you could become the Pope back then is to have the wealthiest family, to be a part of a genealogy, or to have someone pay for it. John the 12th is one of the people whose parents paid for them to be the Pope, but maybe didn't want to be popey. I don't think that's a noun, sorry. So he was elected to the office because of his dad's connections and because he was bisexual and not even Christian, turned the place into a, quote, whorehouse of gambling, killing, toasting the devil, and taking money to declare people bishops. So maybe not the one to like put on your bumper sticker, but just know that there have been popes who were bisexual. Several of them, in fact, before we get to the end of the list. Elsuin of Tours was a leading figure in the Caledonian Renaissance by the late 7th and 8th centuries, and wrote about love quite a bit, and wrote to a male friend, "I think of your love and friendship with such sweet memories, Reverend Bishop, that I long for that lovely time when I may be able to clutch the neck of your sweetness with the fingers of my desires. Alas, if only it were granted to me, as it was to Habakkuk, to be transported to you, how I would sink into your embraces. How much would I cover with tightly pressed lips, not only your ears and eyes and mouth, but also your every finger and toe, not once, but many a time." So he wrote a lot of poetry. You might want to read it. Some of it's interesting. Do we know that it meant for sure he lived out his sexuality? We do not. But it's interesting to know how many queer saints there are, especially if when you were growing up, you believed there were none. Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc maybe might have been one that you already know about. Joan of Arc cuts their hair, wears women's clothes, and insisted on male attire, is successful in several battles, but angered folk like Charles VII. And 25 years later, folk were appealing to the Pope and to try to get an annulled judgment. There is some writings that Joan repents and doesn't want to wear men's clothing anymore. It's hard to know if that was like an apologetic writing where they were like, no, really, like right before they died, they were like, I'm not into that anymore. Or if that was real, we don't know. It appears that Joan was maybe pardoned for a second for declaring that they would stop wearing men's clothes, but then is like, nah, and is found wearing men's clothes again and then is killed. But come on, this image is pretty cool. Saint Paula of Avila is someone, so this happens quite often in these texts, and it is kind of cool. It's people who don't want to get married, and then God grows them a beard overnight, like a full-on beard. While just having a beard and being female doesn't make you queer, it is a strange happening, and so I'm just noting it here, that these tales of people whose bodies don't look like they fit the gender that others around them are believing is what a body should look like, and then end up killing them because of that. And so not all of these are happy stories of them kind of living out their days in monasteries. This is someone who is then tortured and beheaded, all because they grew a beard and didn't want to get married. Pelagia and Pelagios is someone, again, who was diagnosed as female when they were born, lived as male, and the interesting part of their story is that at this time you couldn't be an actor and be baptized, and so that's an interesting thing to learn, right? Is that you weren't allowed to do that. This person took care of teaching people who were baptized, gave away all of their treasures, and was baptized and allowed to receive communion, even though they were an actor, and slipped away from Antioch dressed as a monk went to Jerusalem and built a hermitage on the Mount of Olives and lived there for 3 years until their death. They were believed to be a eunuch, which is a male who hasn't, a male whose kind of penis was crushed in a way that maybe they didn't go through puberty. The idea is that like either by choice or someone else is doing, or by their own, by an accident, that they don't go through the puberty that gives them facial hair. And so this is often the story that is attached to folk who were born female at birth, but who lived as male. Like the reason they're not growing a beard is because they were eunuchs. And so on their death, the mourners chanted, "Glory be to Lord Jesus, for thou hast many hidden treasures on earth, female as well as male." So they were celebrated because it was discovered that their body was different than the way they identified to the world, which not cool at a funeral for people to chant things about parts of your body that are private, but is helpful just to have other stories of folk who were queer. Paulinius of Nola was a bishop, and he was married to a woman, but also passionately in love with a fellow Christian and teacher, the writer Ausonius. Later in life, Paulinius distanced himself from Ausonius, a victim perhaps of a narrowing view of sexual ethics. St. Paul. St. Paul is a curious one because it's hard to know what St. Paul's sexuality is. There's writing in Paul's letters that make it clear that sexuality is something that terrifies Paul, and that there is a thorn in his flesh, and he seems to maybe be against exploitative types of gay relationships. And so despite his kind of people perceiving that he has these very narrow views, there are a lot of people who thought of Paul as someone who was gay. Marina Marinos of Antioch was another ascetic who was diagnosed as female at birth and wore male monastic habits, though we know less about them than some of the others. Oh, by the way, in the bottom left-hand corner of each of these slides on the PDF, you can find out where you can read more about folk if you'd like to learn more. All right, oop, I went too far, sorry. Wilgefortis. Wilgefortis is one of my favorites because Wilgefortis is another one of those saints who grows a beard because they don't want to have to get married. But look how like beautiful their paintings are. And I live in San Francisco, where we have a group called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which are bearded folk in drag. And so I think beards and dresses look great together. Wilgefortis's dad, though, is like still wants Wilgefortis to get married even after they wake up with the full beard. So they have Wilgefortis go down the aisle at their wedding with like a veil, but it didn't work because they had a really big beard. And the suitor refused to marry Wilgefortis when the veil was lifted. So that was probably a gaspy kind of moment at the wedding. And then she was crucified by her father, the King of Portugal. And often painted with the violinist at the bottom, but I don't remember why. So Wilgefortis. Another Marina and Marinos, this one of Sicily. And what I hope you're noticing is that like these saints came from kind of all over, right? Not just in the places that you might expect there to be some gender creativity. But another person who was diagnosed as female at birth and wore male monastic habits And this time, just because they wanted to be with their dad at the monastery. Daniel of the Lion's Den was known to have a coat of many colors that could have been like a wink, wink rainbow coat. There were some who believed that he was a eunuch, and because he was painted so often, he's another one who was just like pretty paintings, and so gained a following. So this idea that they were a eunuch could have been a way to say that there was some transness going on. Other people say that he probably was gay, and they just used that word to kind of point it out. So hard to know, but Daniel had tender love with the chief eunuch. All right, this is a longer one. So Simeon of Emesa and John, Simeon, known as the Holy Fool, lived in the 6th century, and they were believed to have had a same-sex relationship with each other. And they met on pilgrimage, they became friends, they never wanted to be apart, and it seems to also have been a part of the Adelphi ceremonies, or the early Christian same-sex wedding ceremonies. These two men then leave the monastery together to be hermits all alone in the woods with each other for 29 years. And we don't know if they had a same-sex sexual relationship, but they were a couple. And they seem to be very connected. This idea that's painted above their faces. Please don't leave, lest I will die, and God demands an account of my soul from you. And so they talk about not even being able to be parted, even at death. So there you go. Catherine of Genoa was born of a noble family, married at 16, devoted herself to helping with the poor. And in 1493, she kissed a nun. There you go. Isn't it weird to think that like 1,000 years later, people would remember that you kissed a nun? Saint Boris. Saint Boris is painted here by the folk from the Trinity store in a very intense stare, like, I'm Saint Boris. Saint Boris was a prince and a martyr. Boris had a squire who he was known to be with, called Gleb or George, and he flung his body on top of Boris right before he was about to be assassinated. Here's another Pope story, Pope Paul II. Pope Paul II had extravagant clothing, tall tale sign, lots of silk, lots of lace, and said to have died from a heart attack in the middle of getting it on with a guy. After Paul II's death, one of his suggestors suggested that he be called Maria Pittisima, Our Lady of Pity, because he was inclined to break into tears during times of crisis. However, some have also suggested that that name was to make fun of his fancy clothes, and sounds like bullying. John Henry Newman was a later addition than some of the other saints, because, you know, I put some of the famous ones in, even if they were later than the early Christian church. Was a convert to Roman Catholicism and is known for lots of writings. And it It seems that he was celibate throughout his whole life, but spent most of his time with his closest friend, Father Ambrose. Some reports state that they laid all night on Ambrose St. John's bed after Ambrose's death and stipulated in his will that he wished to be, and in fact was, buried in the same grave as Father St. John at Rednall in the English Midlands. Pope Sixtus IV, born Francesco della Rovera. Pope Sixtus IV was appointed his nephew, Raphael Raiaro, to the office of the Papal Chamberlain and Bishop of Ostia, and is known for the founding of the Sistine Chapel. Pope Alexander VI was also allegedly bisexual, fathered several children with several mistresses, and he also was thought to have several handsome male pages as lovers. And maybe the most telling, one of them was a man named Jem. Saint Susanna, or also known as John, was a female-born ascetic who wore male monastic habits and refused to give up their identity even when they were condemned falsely for rape. Bernard of Clairvaux was a French Christian, a churchman who was a merciless zealot and had an erotic relationship with Jesus, whom he called his divine lover and husband. After Bernard's death, many French individuals believed that if they passed under the rainbow of Saint Bernard, that they would undergo gender metamorphosis. Maybe that was near where the abbot of Drimunda was when they fell asleep at Easter. Saint Augustine of Hippo, a bishop and a doctor, grumpy dude if you've ever read any of his writings, considered one of the greatest fathers of the church, and is aggressively anti everything involving the body, let alone sex. But at times, he also spoke out violently against sodomy. But as extracts from his confessions show, he was for a time completely in love with another man, whose death threw him into turmoil and brought him into faith. The most famous conversion in Christian history after St. Paul originated in one man's love for another. I wish people who converted to Christianity who were in love with men would have been nicer to gay men. The feast of St. Giles is on September 1st. He was known as a phallic saint. There were several saints that they aren't certain if they actually existed. It was just a way of taking kind of some of the folk who worshipped body parts involved with fertility and giving them a way to be a bit more Christian. And so St. Giles is the saint who represented the penis. I don't know that I have more to say about that. Theodora and Theodoros of Alexandria was another monk who was diagnosed as female at birth. Theodora was married to a good man, but was unfaithful to him. This is very different than a lot of the other stories where the men sexually were having a hard time in monogamy. Here, Theodora is not faithful, but then feels really guilty about it and leaves wearing men's clothes. Theodora then was admitted into a monastery and lived there and was accused there of fathering a child. Expelled from the monastery, they lived alone with the baby for 7 years until they were allowed back into the monastery and continued to live there until they died. Thecla is one of maybe the most documented of these saints that were diagnosed as female at birth and then dressed as men. There's actually a book called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. Yes, that Paul. Paul who wrote the book of Romans. Thecla hears Paul preaching outside the window of her house and hears Paul talking about celibacy and becomes converted. And their mother, this is a story of yucky mothers instead of fathers, but Thecla's mother decides that Thecla needs to get married. Thecla refuses. Thecla's mother has her burned at the stake, but Thecla does not burn. Then her mother still has not given up and is a part of making it so that Thecla is thrown into an arena with a bunch of lions. But the female lions are like, good for you, Thecla, not marrying that guy. I don't think they could talk. But the implication in the story is the lions are like, yeah, good on you. And all the women in the arena, they see the female lions being like, yeah, we're not going to eat this one. And they're like, woo, Thecla. And she gets so popular that she's like, peace out. And they let Thecla go. But Thecla doesn't like hang out and become well known as the didn't burn the fire and didn't get eaten by the lions person. Thecla cuts their hair into a boy's style, puts on male clothes, and then goes to try to find Paul to like hang out with Paul for a while because that was the person who inspired Thecla. And then Paul's like, I don't know if I should hang out with somebody dressed up in male attire. I don't know if this is going to look good for me. So can you just like stay here and preach to people? But maybe I'm going to go over there. And so it seems kind of like Paul's like nervous about Thecla being around. And so Thecla like lives in a cave and preaches from there, and people come visit Thecla. It's a good book, Acts of Paul and Thecla. Sergius and Bacchus are also our two famous saints, thought to be two Roman soldiers and lovers. They were invoked repeatedly in the Middle Ages, particularly in the blessings of same-sex couples. They were arrested because they were Christian, and Bacchus was killed first, and then a few days later, Sergius. But their joint passion is a very erotic word in the Greek that is used to describe them. And then after he died, Bacchus offers himself to Sergius as a prize for martyrdom, which is kind of creepy, but I guess back then in the Middle Ages, they thought it was like a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. So the other thing that you should know about this is that they were, it seems, either required to wear female clothes because they were two men who loved each other, or people just painted them that way to mock them. It's not entirely certain, but these are two of the only saints who were diagnosed as male at birth, who then wear women's clothing. It's normally a trajectory that goes the other way. Because the status at the time of these stories was that you gained status by wearing male clothes and you lost status by wearing female clothes. This is the one I couldn't find an icon for. Athanasia or Athanasios of Antioch, another person who was designated as female at birth and wore male monastic habits, was married to a husband, became a widow, then lost the child that they had, decided to become an ascetic after that, went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and upon the advice of an abbot they met there, they had been, so this is a story that kind of mixes a lot of the stories. So they had been disfigured, so they didn't look female to someone who then suggested that they go to a monastery. So they hung out at the monastery for a little while, and this abbot Daniel, who was the one who invited them to the monastery, the story is that like they had a vow of silence for 20 plus years, or for 12 years, sorry, and that's why it wasn't figured out until after they died. It's kind of how the story went. So who knows who knew what and when, but it's an interesting story. Wish we had an icon. Someone should paint an icon for it. Anna, or Euphemios of Constantinople, was widowed and lost a child. After first becoming a nun, began dressing as a man and took a male name. They were presumed to be a eunuch again and invited to a monastery near Constantinople, but then were forced to leave the monastery because another monk suspected that they were female. So they just went to a different monastery where they were until they died. Sister Bernadetta Carlini was a Catholic mystic and a lesbian nun who lived in the Counter-Reformation in Italy, and was part of the way that she was a nun who was a lesbian is that Sister Bartholomew would take the form of Jesus, because they were married to Jesus, in the appearance of an adolescent boy with a deepened voice. And so Sister Bernadetta Carlini really liked it when Sister Bartholomewia was a young boy with a deep voice. Matrona Bablis of Perg was also diagnosed as female at their birth. They fled a terrible husband, and this terrible husband is so bad that they have to flee over and over and over again. That's how bad the domestic violence in this story is. So they flee in male clothing to a monastery. Then they are discovered and they become an abbess, and then they leave because their husband comes again, and then they hide in a heathen temple and live as a recluse until the terrible husband dies. Barbara was an Amazonian Catholic saint and rebelled from their pagan father and refused to marry by rejecting all suitors. Sound familiar? Converting to Christianity and converting a bathhouse into a church. Legend has it that Barbara's father retaliated by dragging them to the top of a mountain and killing them. Only instead of the father killing Barbara, the dad was killed by lightning. And as he came back down the mountain. Oh no, the dad did kill her. Then the lightning kills the dad. So Barbara is celebrated as a gender variant, transgender, macho male saint who can control lightning. Which I guess, could have been a different way that the Abraham story went. Venantius Fortunatus is another bishop who liked to write saucy poetry and was a court poet and a spiritual ancestor of same-sex lovers. It's hard to know what their true embodiment was, but the poetry inspired people who were gay, and good enough for my list. So you can check out his poetry if you're interested. And interestingly, the poem's also in Catholic hymns. St. John of the Cross was a priest and a doctor and one of the great Spanish mystics, known for writing The Dark Night of the Soul, a book that might be helpful right now for what do you do when tough times come and your faith is put to the test. And he discussed the sexual stimulation of prayer, and that he became sexually aroused while he was praying. Particularly with the male Christ. And so he was one of those folk, one of the few folk who we know who took their marriage to Jesus physical. The three young men, also thought of as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, thought to be three eunuchs. And so again, as I said before, the eunuchs might have been transgender, they might have been gay men. It's not always entirely clear in the text. And while most eunuchs sometimes were excluded from community, it seems that these three were included in God's blessing. And so there you go. Good job, three young men. Ruth and Naomi. Ruth and Naomi have a love for each other that is quoted more often at weddings than any other love text. That where you go, I will go. Where you trod, I will trod. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. This lovely text of loving each other the bestest. And Ruth is like several folk, like David, who we'll talk about later, who has someone they love the best, who is of the same sex, and then ends up marrying someone of the opposite sex later. It could be that they were bisexual. It could be that what they needed to survive economically was to get married in a relationship that was going to bring them wealth. We don't really know, but it is queer. Protus and Hyacinth were martyrs and eunuchs and companions of Saint Eugenia. And they have a kind of romantic journey. It's not entirely clear if their romantic journey was just between the two of them, but also with Saint Eugenia. But they are here. John, the evangelist, yes, John, who wrote the book of the Bible. This works. It's mostly about whomever is the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple in the book of John. I just really like this painting of John because, yeah, that's a very queer painting of John, right? And so whomever the beloved disciple is the one that Jesus loved. And there are some commentaries that talk about that the words Jesus and the beloved disciple have while Jesus is on the cross is similar to a Jewish wedding ceremony, that the way that they loved each other was similar to that. And if you want to read more about that, you can read The Man Jesus Loved, Homoerotic Narratives from the New Testament. It's a good book. Some people think the beloved disciple was Lazarus as well. David the prophet. David loved Jonathan more than anyone else. If you read about their love, sauntering around in the woods, it's a beautiful love story, although David then has a lot of wives after that and is sexually a predator to other women. So who's to say what to make of that, other than consent is very important, and David, it was not cool. The last saint that I want to tell you about is you, right? And there's time for questions as well, if anyone wants to start putting questions in the chat box or in here. But Matthew 25 says, you who are accursed to depart from me in eternal fire prepared by the devils, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, naked and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, a stranger or naked, sick or in prison, and did not take care of you? And then he will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, right? So think about this idea in the book of Matthew of the least of these being the ones that Jesus is meaning that you are a part of this beloved body of Christ. It doesn't say unless your bodies are very difficult. And I've intentionally done this wood print drawing that's on this page to have diverse types of bodies. There have been times in human history when it was against the law to be LGBTQ. That law wasn't changed until the late 70s here in San Francisco. You could be arrested just for being in a gay bar. You could be arrested for being near a gay person. You could be arrested, and sodomy wasn't overturned until woefully late in our nation's history. And so just know that these texts about saying there Jesus is means that you, dear one, are on that way of being a saint. There's also tons of other saints that you could add to the list if you add contemporary LGBTQ folk. On my prayer list and on my saints list is Matthew Shepard and other contemporary heroes. Today, Virginia Malincott died, or at least her obituary was in the New York Times today. So much of the work that has been done to talk about the queerness of Christianity and all the different names, the diverse names for God and for trans folk and for ways of viewing the world come from these great folk that we kind of are indebted to as we think about what our Christianity means and what it can mean for others. So I'll keep talking for a little bit just to see if y'all have questions. If you don't have questions, then I'll sign off for you. But know that I'm super delighted to have been able to put together this slideshow because it's been fun for me to be able to put some of the icons with some of the stories, and they are, some of them, far-fetched. That's fine. What stories of like faithful people don't have a tendency to like make them a little bit grander, right? And know that you can share the video with other people if you would like. You can share the audio with other people that if you would like. If you'd like to read more about any of these folks, the link will be in the PowerPoint. And also, if you give me about an hour-ish, I'm going to put together a bibliography of different books that you can check out if you want to learn more about these saints. Yeah. So I think there has also been a wonderful number of people who have considered celibacy for their own life, some who felt called to celibacy and some who felt that because there was kind of a don't ask, don't tell mentality to some faith groups, that celibacy was the most faithful way to live. And so I also think I would add to this list, if we were looking at more contemporary folk, the people who became monastic or who were celibate when they were faith leaders because they believed that the church needed them to be, particularly if they didn't feel called to it, but they did it anyway. I consider that a great act of faith. It's not something that folks should tread into lightly, but I can't tell you the number of folk who have tried monastic life and then become Lutheran pastors or become pastors in other denominations. And it's such a wonderful journey for people to get to be in community with each other, to get to love each other, and to get to love God. And even better if those communities can welcome kind of the full fabulousness of the bodies that we have. So here's my mission for you all. You have now seen slides of 58 different queer saints. This means when people say this LGBTQ stuff, it's brand new, it's never existed before, it's like a made up new way of being in the world, you now know, like, take 5 people from the list that you feel like you could talk about and celebrate them. Let's make the next generation of people know 100% in their hearts that like queer people have always been a part of faithfulness in every part of the world. And in fact, many of these saints that I talked to you about are only on the saints list because they were queer. People adored queer people, not always. There's a lot of martyrs in the list too, right? But this idea that conservative folk or non-queer folk own tradition is hooey, right? There's so much fabulous history that we need to share it with as many people as possible. And now you get to share this information on with other people. And if someone says, oh, but it never used to be that way, Jesus never knew anyone who was gay, you can say, aha, Thecla, aha, like pick your favorites, Wilgefortis, right? So hopefully this was helpful. If you liked it, I'm so glad. Take care, everybody. I'll see you next time. So grateful that you came.